So like if you have sex less than 10 times a year, that's how it's been defined for purposes of research. And so how common it might be is somewhere around there. They're putting it around 20% or up to 20% of marriages can experience a sexless marriage.
You're listening to Get Your Marriage On, the fun and spicy podcast bringing you new tools and fresh ideas so that you can be the sexiest couple you know.
Everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Get Your Marriage On. I'm so happy that you spend your time here week after week. Now, I've learned that intimacy problems can creep into the marriage because of unrealistic expectations and patterns of avoiding issues in the relationship. Whether it's performance anxiety, body image issues, or even if you're in a sexless marriage, you can break out of your patterns that keep you stuck by getting a clearer understanding of your dynamic. And this is what I've learned from our guest today, Braxton Dutson. And he's here to talk about what to do when you find yourself in a sexless marriage or where sex is not as satisfying or as frequent as you would like. Braxton is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified sex therapist through the AASECT. He hosts another podcast called the Birds and the Bees podcast, which, as you can guess, talks about sexual health and sexual education topics for both parents and how parents can talk about sexual health to their children. And if that wasn't enough, Braxton is an adjunct professor of human sexuality at the University of Utah College of Social Work. Now, before we jump into the episode, I want to invite you to the marriage retreat that I'm hosting with my friend Amanda Lauder, taking place this October 13th through 16th. It's a 3-day, 3-night, amazing retreat. It's a romantic getaway for you and your spouse. Retreats have always been great for my wife and I. It gives us time away from the whirlwind of life, lets us slow down, really connect with each other, and we learn new things that take our marriage to the next level. Anyway, please join us. If you're interested, the details are available on my website. Go to getyourmarriageon.com and click on Marriage Retreat. Braxton, it is such a pleasure to have you on the Get Your Marriage On podcast today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Dan. I love talking about marriage and I love talking about sexual health.
Very good. And it's awesome to have another sex therapist on our podcast today. And today we're talking specifically about sexless marriages. Oh, yeah. So what is a sexless marriage?
So a sexless marriage, defining it is interesting because the researchers are putting it up to a space of like, if you have sex less than 10 times a year, that's how it's been defined for purposes of research. And so how common it might be is somewhere around there. They're putting it around 20% or up to 20% of marriages can experience a sexless marriage. But when we start working into individual and couples relationships, someone may define a sexless marriage as, well, we have sex 12 times a year or even beyond that, but it still feels distressing. So even if you're like, well, we hit 11, we're not in a sexless marriage, but you're still feeling distress, you may still be addressing a lot of things we're talking about today may still fall into your wheelhouse. Or even if you find yourself in a low sex marriage versus a sexless one, definitions like this always are a little bit hard just because everyone gets to define them just a little bit different. In each situation, the distress is real, even if you don't fall under the bell curve of what a sexless marriage would be.
Gotcha. It's not how frequent are you, like, counting. It's really about, this is distressing that we're not connecting sexually to the level that I would like, or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. So we have to, we'll define a little bit of that as we get into the podcast, but per research, whenever you hear, like if you read a book and they're like, sexless marriages account for 20%, they're usually talking about if you're having sex less than 10 times a year.
But there's so many factors involved. Anyway.
Yeah.
But the researchers, I get it. They have to draw a line in the sand somewhere if
Yes.
you're going to do any quantitative analysis. So, all right.
Absolutely.
So how do couples fall into a sexless marriage? How does this happen?
So being in a sexless marriage can happen in a myriad of different ways. Some of the things that come up most common, or that I've seen, as well as what research has been describing, is the one that I see come into my office most often is the vicious cycle. There's a lot of expectations, and Dan, we've got to talk about the expectations of what we think sex should be, because those often start these vicious cycles. One of them that has come in most is male sexual performance. So we're talking, how long do I last? Being able to keep and maintain an erection, and the expectations that society typically places on male-bodied individuals as well as female-bodied individuals. How much you're supposed to want it, how lubricated you're supposed to be, how orgasmic you're supposed to be, as well as if female pleasure is involved in the relationship. So what I typically see in this cycle is that, say for one thing, a guy, a male-bodied person comes into the relationship, he loses an erection, and now anxiety starts. Oh no, I don't know that I can. I don't know that I can get it up. I'm not sure about this, and I've just disappointed my partner. And oh no, so we start this anxious.
He freaks out.
Yes.
And he
like,
makes
no.
it mean something it really isn't, like I'm not manly or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, it attacks the manliness.
Yes.
So then there's stress that starts around sex. And then the next time we're about to go into it, maybe what that stress will actually affect erections, orgasm, things like that. And so then it's like, oh no, I've got ED, premature ejaculation. I'm not the lover I'm supposed to be. And then avoidance may start to happen. Or there's no pleasure for the male partner or female partner, and I don't really like to engage in sex, or there's been pain emotionally or physically, and we don't address those. And so every time it starts to come up, there's avoidance, that's clunky, it hurts, and we don't address them. And so what happens is the avoidance start to happen. So fights will happen before sex does, just to keep sex out of the relationship. That's
right. Because if I'm fighting with you, then I don't have to engage sexually with you. So it's like a defense mechanism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we can get negative cycles like that we just said. Also,
and it begins with avoidance.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. That avoidance. Well, it can begin with avoidance. It can also begin with expectations.
Oh, expectations
that aren't met.
Right, which leads to the avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think couples like, so if they avoid, but then they do decide to come together sexually, there's so much more pressure because they have been avoiding? Mm-hmm. Again, it's expectations, right? Yep. Now they've set the expectations even higher, so the chance of failure is higher. Mm-hmm. It just makes things worse even more.
Especially because there usually is a point of we have to achieve blank. That could be orgasm, penetrative sex, not fighting. Like they're focused on everything but connecting and being together and enjoying each other. It becomes more of a task.
Yes.
And that makes things really difficult when sex needs to be used in order to get to a certain place. And a lot of us don't like to feel like we fail. And if you feel like you fail, you start to go, well, that's just not. That's a common experience.
Right.
Another one that I'd see is anxiety and depression. It's hard to want to engage in a sexual experience if you're feeling really anxious, like we talked about just a second ago, and feeling down, not feeling well.
Yeah. Yeah. So if that's ongoing, of course, you wouldn't want to engage sexually.
Yes. And then one of the other ones that can be kind of sneaky, this one's a growing family. Here in Utah, we have a lot of young growing families. And when people are family planning and experiencing new children, and moving into their parenting roles, or maybe they've been in parenting roles for a long time, but now you've got kids that are going off to baseball, and you've got this, and they're in drama, and they're doing all the things that they are doing, and you're doing everything you can just to get through the next day. And we get to the end of the day and you're just so tired, but the end of the day has usually been saved for sex. But you're so tired that it's so hard to decide, okay, let's have sex, or let's really engage with each other. It just kind of continues to get put off and put off and put off. And so that's kind of a sneaky one that will come, and all of a sudden we're like, wow, I don't know that we've had sex in months. And that can be something that plays into it. Or you don't feel, kids aren't super sexy. And so if you're like, oh, the kids are next door, I don't really want to. And there's a lot of stressors that can come from family planning that will push sex off of the radar.
So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's no longer first priority. It just fell down the priority list.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It fell down the priority list. It doesn't, it makes it harder to engage in. And I would say one of the last ones, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are really common to look at. And the other one's trauma. trauma within the relationship, trauma within the family unit, trauma in the sexual experience. If someone's experienced a sexual assault before, or been made fun of, or we had a really traumatic experience in the relationship from someone's verbalizing. Like I've had people say like, oh, well, that wasn't what I expected on a honeymoon or in the first couple weeks of a relationship, and it really felt like a rejection.
Yeah.
And then as time's gone on, it's like, well, this isn't what I thought sex was going to be. And why aren't you different? And why don't you want sex more? And there's a lot of criticism that can come in that can feel traumatic. Prior sexual abuse can be traumatic, physical abuse in the relationship, or even just contempt and hurt within the relationship. It's hard when we're constantly at each other to be able to go, oh, now I want to have sex with you.
Yeah. So how do you address these things as a sex therapist? Let's do the first one, where it becomes kind of it's an expectation issue.
So expectations, one of the first ones is changing our expectations. When that cycle is going, one of the first things that I'm doing with all couples, all individuals that find themselves in that is, how do we change the expectations and the way we communicate about sex? Because oftentimes, I'm going to tell you, Dan, one of the most common things I see is, I want to have sex like the movies, which means I don't want to talk about it. I just want to have sex.
And I want to be passionate and steamy, and
yes,
there's no cleanup involved.
They never talk in those sex scenes. Very few is it like, hey, you want to go to the bed? And oh, is this all right? Is it? It's just not light, sensual music. Everyone's having and getting the exact experience they want. And so the expectation comes up, don't talk about it and just be a good lover. We can change that very quick to change expectations to know, what would you like tonight? And this is kind of what I'm looking for. Are you open to that? Or can we help get you in the mood to do that? Those two questions can be really helpful. And the other part is exploring, show me what you like to experience. I want to know what you like to experience. Oh, you don't know? Let's see if we can figure some things out, and just no one take it personal. Let's experience and go with the flow. I think of it in the sense of pleasure and connection. If we can move away from orgasm and performance to pleasure and connection, all of a sudden we can be connected. Maybe we don't have, especially when we're starting in a sexless marriage, say you're like, we don't do this ever. Not starting into, all right, let's go to penetrative sex, or all right, let's go to genital touching and orgasm. But we start into, I want to feel connected with you and I want to feel pleasure with you. You can feel pleasure by cuddling, holding, having a really deep conversation while you stare into each other's eyes. There's a lot of pleasure and connection that can happen without genitals and without breasts. And you can move your way into that by building the connection, by building strength together. And a big part is that starts to disrupt some of those cycles, especially if you can change your expectations of your own performance. Like if you need an erection to have a sexual experience, but you're getting older, or the stress makes it so that you don't, it's hard to maintain an erection, or you have a physical issue that's going on that affects your erections. If you can take that expectation out, all of a sudden you can still be a very good lover without penile functioning, and you can still experience a lot of pleasure that way too. Same way with if you're a female bodied person and you're saying that you don't have as much lubrication as you'd like, but we bring in lube, or we bring in other things that some people have been like, well, that means I'm less than a person. Like, no, we just need to roll with some of those things and change those expectations.
And this sounds like it involves letting go of your ego. I can hear, like, in the back of my mind, like, well, that's not the answer I wanted to get. Right?
Yeah. And I think that's what makes people, I've had some people frustrated in my therapy office because they were expecting me to have like this trick or a couple of really good suggestions that would be like, you need to do this position, or you need to just
do more Kegels. I don't know.
Or prescribe them. You need sex once a week. Come back and tell me that you did it. And that in of itself, most of the time we are focused on how can we communicate? When can we start engaging in sex differently? Let's not save it till 11 p.m. And then exploring some of the hurts that have happened, because usually in a sexless marriage, there has been enough distress whether it's been from kids or the experience like we just talked about, that there's been a pattern and we're trying to break that pattern to be able to start a new pattern.
Yeah. And then addressing the hurts. I think that's
Mhm.
also an issue because things pile up so much over time.
Yeah.
And each person in the relationship gets more entrenched in their position.
Mhm.
How do you help couples see that, like, they have co-constructed this kind of relationship? It's so easy to point the finger at the other person, like, no, you need to make the first move. You need to start initiating more. You need
Oh,
to like doing that. They don't see that they're just as entrenched too. How do you help them?
one common thing that I see in many relationships is the one you just said. I make the first move all the time. I'm done making the first move. I'll just let the other person do it because they're the low drive partner.
Oops, that's like the devil's pact.
And I get the reason why we've come up with this, because
Uh-huh.
I don't like to feel rejected. Most people don't like feeling rejection. So then they turn it to the person and say, well, I will always say yes. So you initiate.
Yes.
The hard part with that is either, again, distress, trauma, or we don't have the same type of drive. And so that leaves one person always wanting and one person typically feeling guilty because they don't initiate. And then the blame gets turned into, well, we would if they were to open their relationship. And I use the word they on purpose because I've worked with female bodied people being in that space and males. And I typically see that there's a lot of shame in both parties. Men feeling like, wow, I should want sex all the time. Everyone I see around me, and women feeling like, well, I just don't want to. And maybe I should want more. How am I broken? Is there a female Viagra I can use? Looking for a quick way to be able to change that.
Or the other way around. Like it
Or the
doesn't,
other way
right?
around. Yeah.
Exactly.
How do I change maybe Viagra would give me desire, and Viagra doesn't give desire. It just
Uh-uh.
gives better blood flow.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That's all that it's doing. So if we can change that pattern and we can start introducing and bringing the one person that's saying, I don't want to feel rejected anymore, I'll just let you initiate, and have them start putting back into the arena, stepping in saying, hey, I'd like to experience a sexual experience with you, while the other person is also trying to engage. And we have conversations about what engagement is versus, hey, you want to have sex? No? All right. Well, that hurt. See ya.
Yeah, exactly. I want to address more about how usually the higher desire spouse gives up, say, all right, I'm not going to initiate anymore. It's all on you, lower desire.
Mhm.
And now the lower desire spouse feels all this pressure. Like if marriage is a system, you took the pressure from the higher desire spouse and just transferred it to the lower desire spouse. Like you haven't alleviated the pressure. It's still in the system.
Mhm.
It's not, you just transferred it.
Yes.
And pressure especially really impedes sexual desire. So
Mhm.
the better way is for what?
So one of the best ways is through another research that we were seeing from that's been presented by Emily Nagoski. At least she's presenting it in her book. She's taken the research and made it a little bit more able
Accessible.
to access it. One of the things that we're seeing is that if we have, like you're saying, that pressure go from one person to another, the hard part is that pressure has typically been put onto a partner that is more of a responsive sexual drive partner. We have we have spontaneous sexual drive, which is kind of the lightning bolt. I am good to go for some sex today. That would be great. And a responsive partner, it may not go across their mind ever. It may come up every once in a while, but not very often. But when sex or sexual connection or something sexually relevant shows up, they're like, oh, actually, that might be something I'm interested in, but I might need a little bit more support. I might need to put myself into that place or have someone help me get into that mood. But when one partner that's spontaneous then goes, all right, I'll just give it to the other person, and they happen to be responsive, then we're hoping that someone that doesn't think about sex very often initiates every time. And then we put ourselves into a space of like, why don't I ever think of sex other than I feel stressed because I know that he's looking for sex or she's looking for sex and I have to initiate, but now it's a should and a duty list, which I will see that the other partner's like, you're just doing this because it's on your list, huh? Now we've created a no-win scenario for both parties, and that cycle continues. So alleviating the pressure typically comes back into communication. Hey, I'm interested in a sexual experience. And I know we haven't engaged in sex, but I don't want you to feel these. I just want to feel close with you. Can we start initiating these other things? Oftentimes, like I said, we jump right into genital touching and going right for penetrative sexual experiences when it's really important to start, hey, let's initiate cuddling. Let's initiate making out. Let's initiate touch that doesn't go straight towards sex. That can oftentimes alleviate pressure and responsibility to perform. And we want to get rid of performance.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I've, as I coach men, I've seen a lot of them. I use the words seek validation through sex, but there's probably other ways to describe it. What I'm trying to say is they kind of had this attitude of, well, if you really love me, it's got to be sex. Like, thank you for the nice birthday gift, but it wasn't sex, so I'm disappointed. Like, it has to be sex. It has to be that, and they'll whip out the 5 love languages. Say, see, I'm physical touch. You see, you got to do this for me. Anyway, it's kind of a weak position because although they don't see it that way, it's if it's not sex, then it doesn't count, kind of an attitude. And I could see how that would really get the couple in trouble in this cycle, because connection and pleasure, like eye gazing, hand holding, laughing together, to them doesn't feel like they're getting that specific type of validation they're looking for.
Absolutely. And I will talk to them like, we got to figure out ways you feel love besides through your penis.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous game to play longevity wise, because research is showing that after age 50 and definitely into 60, the majority of male-bodied people will experience differences in their erections, whether it just be not as hard or kind of inadvertent if it comes or if it doesn't. And we can work with that. But there again, if that's the only way that you can feel like this total love, I've worked with men before that are in that position where a medical issue or age or something happens and erections are affected because it's affected by the nervous system, the vascular system. There's a lot that affects the erections.
Yes.
That later on down the road somewhere, you may be like, oh no, this is where I stopped feeling love. I know it's not the logical side of things, but that's essentially what can kind of come up. So if we can start looking into ways that you do feel love, especially ways that your partner is trying to, just because we have a physical touch is the love language. Physical touch is not just what happens to your genitals. It's all about being able to be touched, touching in the hallways, being close to someone, having their legs on you while you're watching a movie. That is what physical touch typically shows. So when I'm working with these men, I often encourage these individuals to take that. And again, I know this goes for female-bodied people too, because there's a lot of high drive women out there too that are going, but Braxton, don't forget about me. But being in a space like this, when someone is like, I only feel a lot of love through sex, we start looking for what are other ways that you feel love and connection. And if you're listening and you're like, no way, there's no other way. This is the only thing I can do with my partner. It's the one thing that we share together. Then I encourage you to go, what are some other things we can share together? Not to try and replace sex, but to take the pressure off of performing and engaging in sex. The more we can take that pressure off, the more we can allow for more connection to come through. And ironically, more sex can show up as pressure is reduced.
That's right. That is more freedom. There's more freedom. There's more playfulness. There's more happiness. Connection.
Absolutely. So I think
that's the state you want to be in. Yeah. You want to be friends, really good friends.
Absolutely. And sometimes people feel triggered by that word. I don't want a friend. I want a lover. And friendship, meaning we can define what friendship means, but being able to feel a closeness. So for those that are listening out there, I try and give some of those abilities to respond or to say like, well, what should I look at? And oftentimes I tell people to look at where do you and how do you connect on a spiritual level, even if it's not in a religion. You know, is it being out in nature? Is it giving your time to other people with your partner? Are you donating time? Are you doing philanthropy work? Are you doing something that makes you feel connected to your community, to a deity, to what spirituality are you experiencing? Focus on mental connection, emotional connection. Those are some other ways. How do you feel close, or what is pleasurable to you in those other areas? Because we know that physical touch is a physical pleasure for you. And what other ways do you feel physical pleasure? That's one of the ways we can start at, but those other three are very important to look at too, that you can share and enjoy with your partner, and that you can feel love from them in that same way, and what love language they're trying to support to you. And you can start to really feel how they're engaging that.
Yeah. So it's a holistic approach to everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very good. So I think a lot of those in Sexless Marriage will read the books. In fact, you'll probably have a book recommendation or two.
Mm-hmm.
They'll consume a lot of content and podcasts and blog posts and everything, because it's easy to get in the consumption trap.
Yes.
What do you encourage them to do?
So first, one thing that I would encourage with starting off, and this can seem counterproductive, but it can also, we're talking about releasing that pressure, right? Taking a logical and mental break from sex can be helpful. And it feels like we came here, Dan, to be able to talk about how we get more sex in the relationship. And if we're in a cycle of having sex and the sex is feeling obligatory, or there's just distress after distress after distress, and it's just something, when it becomes too hot to handle, you let it cool down. So we take sex off the table for a little bit. Give it a break. What that allows is not just, give it a break, it'll cool down, then go back and heat it back up again. It is, if you can take sex off the table and really work on your relationship connection, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and not just physically in the sex mode. We're talking being close, everything we've been talking about in here that is not going to lead to sex. All of a sudden you have a partner that can start to relax into a physical touch, an emotional experience, a mental experience, without the thought being like, ooh, if I engage here, because this happens a lot, if I engage in rubbing their back, they're going to want sex, and I am not in a place to do that. So we don't rub backs. If I give them a compliment, or if I flirt with them, they're going to think I'm in the mood for sex. So I'm not going to flirt. There's a complete drawback. But if we take sex off the table as a conscious way, not just individually, but we say, hey, let's just, for a month or a couple of weeks, or we may not be having sex any time during that anyway. So let's take it off the table and we just engage together. That even if we want to, it starts going that direction. You're like, man, I do want sex. We're not having sex right now. You allow space for you and your partner to really connect, and then to talk like, man, I was feeling really turned on. Thank you for that. That was exciting. I really liked feeling connected with you. That was pleasurable for me. Communicate what you liked and do it more often. That can lead back into sexual practices. You can ease into it versus, all right, well, we did that. Now let's go to sex, because it can be such a jump. Yeah,
got it. So taking those breaks are helpful if the purpose is to break a bad habit, break a bad cycle. Yep. That's what you're trying to do. Establish new, better, healthier patterns.
Yes. And healthier patterns, as well as taking that pressure off and allowing for us to relax. I can't tell you how many people that have been in session with me where, again, everything has just, we're separate people and we don't engage, because any type of engagement together feels like the next move towards sex, and that's too much pressure for one person, and a fight usually happens. So they both say, all right, hands off. We won't, you be your ship, I'll be mine. We'll pass in the night and we'll do the things that our logistical marriage.
That doesn't help anything.
No, it makes both people really frustrated in a lot of ways.
Yeah, very good. All right. Any book recommendations?
One that's really that comes up with a lot of research, a lot of what we're talking about today, is called Rekindling Desire by Barry McCarthy. And I can't remember the other McCarthy. But anyways, if you look at Barry McCarthy and
I've read some of his books. They're really good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's another McCarthy that's a part of that. But that is Rekindling Desire is a long book, but it's got a lot of really great information, ideas, tips, thoughts, experiences, that if you find yourself in a low sex or a sexless marriage or relationship, that book can be really helpful. Also understanding Emily Nagoski's work that we were talking about earlier, Come As You Are, COME as you are, is all about the research on sexual desire, drive, curiosity, what helps turn on our ons and what helps us release our brakes, the things that turn us off, and understanding like where you are in a spectrum of desire. Those two books, I would say, combo real well together. And then the third, to create the triad, if you will, would be Better Sex Through Mindfulness. It's typically gauged towards female-bodied individuals, but I find that the content's very relevant for male-bodied individuals as well. But it's all about being able to experience sex versus doing sex. Because one thing that I find with these couples in sexless marriages is that oftentimes there does feel like there's a pressure to perform or to do something. And so if something starts to go wrong, or we're nervous that something isn't going to happen, then we're focused on that, or how our body looks, or if their partner likes this or not. And we're not focused on what feels pleasurable and connecting, and we're not communicating. And the better we can get into, oh, this feels good, I'm experiencing this, versus performing, you can relax into it instead of feel very tense. And the tension usually leads to distress.
So Braxton, I can see how a couple in a sexless marriage really wants to change things. They'll hit the books, they'll listen to the podcasts, they'll do a lot of things on their own. They might make some progress, but how do you know at what point should you go seek professional help?
It's a good question, Dan. Seeking professional help is most supported early on, as early as possible. If you're doing this and you're finding that some of the basics, like what we've talked about today, aren't getting you to the place that you want to, don't wait years to engage that, because that can affect that cycle. Getting into a sex therapist, especially one that does couples work, is a really great way to go about that. And if you don't have a sex therapist that's close to you, then finding someone that's focused on attachment, like emotionally focused therapy, can be really helpful. There's therapists that are trained in that, but finding someone that can help identify your cycles is really important, because then you've got someone in the room helping you see where you're coming from, because it's not just a one-person thing. Even if you've prescribed it to one partner, each partner plays a role in continuing to pass the ball back and forth and to get into that cycle. Therapists are really great at being able to go, oh, hold on, what's happening for you right now? As you just said this, what's going on for your partner? What do you imagine is happening for them? What's going on for you? And what happened in this last time when you guys tried to engage and didn't? A therapist is there to be able to help break things down, to break down the cycle, to help you start a new one, and to start talking and engaging together to speak about it while you're trying to make changes. And so that one can help a lot. And if you come earlier, it makes it a little bit more, you're more susceptible to make those changes versus continuing to solidify a problematic or distressing cycle.
Yeah, I love it. Great. Okay, let's say you're a couple, you've mastered these things that you've talked about. There's a lot more ease in the relationship now, and you've dealt with the pressure and you're engaging sexually. Now you're ready to take things to the next level. What are your black belt sex tips?
Oh, the black belt sex tips. So I love that you're bringing up black belt, because one thing that I've learned, I participate in jiu-jitsu. And one thing that I've learned from the senseis I've worked with and the other black belts is that when you are a black belt, it is very little about this is what I do next, and this is my next move, and this is how I'm going to conquer this person. It is a flow. And it's still kind of beyond me because I'm not a black belt. I'm still in the white and blue area. And so I'm still like, I got to do this and force this and make this happen.
Step 1, step 2, step 3. You keep doing that. Right.
Get this done so I can win the jiu-jitsu match. And so what I'm seeing from the black belt, I love that question for it, because in sex, when people are like, what's the black belt? What's the mastery of sex? It's very little about this is the move. That's what you're going to see in Cosmopolitan and these other ones, 500 ways to do this. When in reality, what it is rolling with what comes at you. Oftentimes, and one of the research parts that I think is interesting is when sex is good in a relationship, it accounts for about 10 to 15% of the relationship satisfaction.
Uh-huh.
When it's not great, it counts for 40 to 50% of the relationship's dissatisfaction. So if we can roll with some of the distress or some of the uncertainty, like, oh, I kind of thought we were going to have sex tonight, but this is something that is different. Let's adjust. How do we feel pleasure and connection? If we can move from this action to this position to this thing so we can feel love, sex, and pleasure, then we can roll with pleasure and connection. You can have a pleasurable experience eating, an erotic experience, eating strawberries, feeding each other, and connecting while telling each other how much you appreciate each other, naked in bed without any type of genital stimulation, to feel a ton of pleasure and a lot of connection. And that can be a really great sexual experience. Equally, you can also be in bed having a sexual experience. Male body person can have an orgasm and it doesn't have to stop. We can continue into what is pleasurable for the person. And we also can stop. No one has to have an orgasm. No one has to experience a certain thing. Bodies don't have to do a certain action. We roll with, I am so grateful and I love that you are being a part of this intimate, connecting experience with me. And this happened, or I'd like this today. So I wonder how we can engage that. Can I give you a back rub to try and support you? Not coercion, but what helps you get in the mood? This? Great. I think I'm open to that. I would love to be connected and experience pleasure with you. That moves us into the black belt realm, because no matter what comes, we can, like what comes out of the experience, kids doing something, work calling in, something not happening the way we want to within our body. It doesn't mean we failed. We just roll with any type of the changes that come up, and we still feel connection and pleasure together.
I love it. That's great. Thank you, Braxton.
You're very welcome, Dan.
How do
Thanks so much.
people find out more about you? How do they contact you?
So I have my own podcast, Birds and Bees Podcast. I also give presentations to large and small groups about sexual health, it's particularly with feeling out of control in sexual behavior, rekindling couples work, as well as just sexual health in general, how to talk about sex to your kids or to clinicians. And if you want to get a hold of me, you can contact me at Braxton T. Dutson. That's BraxtonTDutson at gmail.com. And ask me about if you've got a question, if you have a presentation or topic you'd like to hear on a podcast, or if you just want to say, hey, this is what we tried out, this is really helpful, or we have this tweak we'd like to do. I'd love to answer any questions there. You can also connect with me on Facebook or Instagram. Look at Braxton Dutson or Birds and Bees Podcast on Instagram.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Get Your Marriage On. And if you did, we would love it if you would take a few seconds to give us a rating on iTunes and to share the show with your friends. They'll thank you for life. Once you've done that, you can head over to getyourmarriageon.com for more resources about today's topic and to download our amazing marriage apps. Now go get your marriage on.